Okay, welcome. Today I wanted to offer some reflections about Eton or Marlborough. Does Prince George get sent to Eton, his father's alma mater, or to Marlborough, his mother's old school? So just talk a little bit about some stories. Got a few stories from Eton, some stories from Marlborough as well, and what I feel about boarding schools. So it's been in the press quite a lot this last year or two about Prince George, who's just turned 12, I believe, on the 22nd of July. And the reason I know that's the same birthday that I have. So he's turned 12. Next year he'll be 13 and he'll be eligible to enter Eton or Marlborough if they choose. And I just wanted to talk a bit today about these two schools. They're talking at the moment. Prince William, he's saying he wants to send his son to Eton, and his wife is saying no, send to Marlborough. And the reason that Kate is giving, that I've read, is that she mentions Eton stuffy, and it's also single sex. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And obviously she knows Marlborough. Her sister as well went there, Pippa. So I'm just going to share a few stories. So first of all, Kate's experience of boarding school. So she was sent to, and you can read about it in this book here, she was sent to boarding school age 13. She went to Marlborough, but she was actually sent to a boarding school before called Downe House, and she was sent for 2 terms. And she basically says in this book, Tina Brown, that she was bullied mercilessly. Basically saying here, another alumni recalled Kate sitting on the stairs at Downe House of her house crying her eyes out. Head teacher Cameron, who sounds like a corporate version of Roald Dahl's Miss Trunchbull, defended the school in words that made Kate sound like a wet blanket. And then basically after a couple of terms, it could be difficult. Yeah, it was so bad that Kate developed stress eczema. Carol and Michael Middleton whipped her out of there fast in the middle of the year. So she did 2 terms and then she was taken out. And then she went to Marlborough College. And it sounds like, from what she says about it, she basically rarely got drunk. She says here, rarely got drunk. Hers was quite an old-fashioned approach, especially at Marlborough, where half of the pupils were already having sex. One of her schoolmates, Gemma Williamson, has said, sounding rather old-fashioned herself. So she basically seems to say that Marlborough, she enjoyed her time there. Interestingly, in a documentary that I'll put the link in the description, it was about an Australian boarding school, private school, where one of the teachers from Marlborough had been involved in sexual abuse, and it was on TV, and they made a documentary about it. And about 40 minutes in, the teacher originally had been in Marlborough, and they interviewed some of the girls who had been there. And one of the girls says the girls were completely outnumbered, and sexist behaviour was tolerated and even encouraged by the teachers. And so that's Marlborough, and that's a couple of years ago. Has it changed? It's difficult for us to say whether these schools have changed. Sexual abuse, often it takes, the average time for a sexual abuse case to come forward is 27 years. And I was speaking to a colleague of mine, Dino Nocivelli, that sexual abuse, he's working with people in teens, and he's one of the leading child sexual abuse lawyers in the country. He's saying that's still going on now. Not necessarily in Marlborough per se, but still happening in these schools. So that's what's happening at Marlborough. So what about Eton? So William's experience of Eton, he was pretty cool. He was, I think, swimming captain. He was popular, and interestingly, and this book here, Spare, by Prince Harry, Prince Harry talks about what it was first like arriving at Eton. So for him, he says here, Willie told me to pretend I didn't know him. What? You don't know me, Harold, and I don't know you. For the last 2 years, he explained, Eton had been his sanctuary. No kid brother tagging along, pestering him questions, pushing up on his social circle. He was forging his own life, and he wasn't to give that up. So just kind of just seeing that, you know, essentially, yeah, he just left his younger brother, who's just lost his mother. Yes, William's lost his mother, but instead of supporting his younger brother, he's kind of just left him there. So it sounds like for Prince William, Eton, was a sanctuary for him. What about for other people? So Ranulph Fiennes, who's the well-known explorer, he basically says here, my great misfortune was to be a pretty little boy. I can hardly blame Eton for that, yet my memories of the place are tarnished because of it. He says those first weeks were like an attempt to gain a set of daily changing objectives blindfolded in a swamp with a host of hostile custodians shouting instructions in weird languages. The fagging system was an ever-present bane of my existence. The 6 senior boys in each house only had to stand at their doors and scream, "Boy!" for every faggable boy within earshot to drop whatever he was doing and head at maximum speed to the source of the scream. And then he basically talks about how boys started to predate on him, calling him a tart. And he replies, I'm not a tart. I protest. I did not realise that any pretty boy at Eton is going to be labelled a tart, and that gossip is based not on what actually happens, but on what the gossipers would like to think has happened. And he says, my tormentors were unremitting. I seriously contemplated throwing myself off the bridge over the Thames between Eton and Windsor, only restrained by the thought of making my mother suffer. So that's Ranulph Fiennes. David Cameron, he was nearly expelled from Eton for smoking marijuana. And Bear Grylls here, he talks about how he was beaten until his shoulder nearly snapped while he was at Eton. So yeah, these are just stories, but what do we really have? We have stories of what these places are like. And I often speak to ex-boarders and they say, oh, I really loved it. And then you ask them the stories. You say, well, what happened? And they say, oh yeah, my housemaster was convicted paedophile. Oh, and I was sexually abused. And I'm like, oh. So it's almost like this dissociation between, oh, I loved it, but this happened to me. This split between the emotions, the feelings. So this is just something I see, and when I read the biographies, and I have about 50 biographies of ex-boarders, most of them talk about similar stories. So, which should they choose, Eton or Marlborough? For me, and the research of Nick Duffel, Joy Chavrian, Simon Partridge has mentioned this as well, is that children shouldn't board under 16. Children need their parents. And 16, if the school is really heart-centered, it's really emotionally intelligent, it really takes care of the kids, great. 16 onwards, I think, is amazing boarding school. At that point, the brain's starting to develop. But 13, you are moving through puberty. You need your own space. You need your own room. You need your own privacy. And you don't really get that. Yes, in Eton, they have rooms for themselves. But once you leave the room, well, you still probably have to have shared showers, etc., etc. So it's not really a space for 13-year-old boys or 13-year-old girls. So for me, yeah, and there's 5 reasons really, and this comes from neuroscience. So first thing, not to send boarders under 16. First is the breaking of attachment. So you break your attachment with the parents, and what that means is you become insecurely attached. And if you become avoidant, you basically say relationships aren't important. You keep them at arm's length. Why this is an issue is in leadership, you need to be really good at relationships rather than saying they're not important. And I've been reading quite a few biographies, leading, leaders. Mike Manasseh, an admiral, US admiral, he says it's about love, it's about care, leadership. Guzen Posner book up there, again, secret ingredient to leadership is love. And yet, if you're breaking the attachment, you're saying love's not important, relationships are not important. That's the first thing. Second thing is about 20% capacity. If you go to these schools, yes, you learn the IQ, you learn, the discipline, but you don't learn the emotional intelligence. As Nick Duffel talks about in Wounded Leaders, he says we become emotionally illiterate in these places. And that's an issue again, because the life successes, it all comes down to the Dunedin study show that 80% is emotional intelligence. It's the people who are most successful are the ones who have been, have learned that emotional intelligence. So that's the second reason I would not recommend sending him to either Eton or Marlborough. I'd say send him to a day school close to home. And they've talked about looking at Highbury. Great. As long as he's not boarding. Then the next one is, they don't teach about relationships in these schools. It's not important. And why that is key is that leadership, and Prince George potentially will go on to be the king. It's all about leadership. It's all about relationships. Cousins and Posen, all about relationships, leadership. And if you've learned that relationships don't matter, breaking that bond with your parent. The next one is to be a great leader, especially moving forward in the next 10, 20 years. Prince George becomes king. He's going to need to be flexible. That's the key thing. And Dr. Sue Gerhardt says that you can't grow a flexible brain without good attachments. You become very rigid if you've learned to be very much, on your own, without attachments with your parents, that rigid brain. Whereas actually what leaders are needing moving forward is flexibility, to be able to move, to see what's needed there. And the final aspect comes from the research of Professor Antonio Damasio, and he says you can't make good decisions without emotional information. So what these schools teach is you can't show emotion, you can't show love, you can't show care, you can't show anger. It's like, nope, it's the stiff upper lip, it's the and therefore we can't make good decisions if we don't have that emotional information. And when he becomes king, he's going to need to make good decisions, which are for the best of the people, not just the best for his class. So just some ideas there, Eton or Marlborough. What do you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts. And I've probably got other biographies up here which talk about, about Eton. I'll see if I can find any more. Obviously Boris, I've got a few up there. And also this book here, actually, which is, I interviewed the author, Zilibe Onyama, talking about how he was racially abused at Eton. So yeah, I just think that's my perspective. What do you feel? Eton or Marlborough, or neither of them? And yeah, keep him at home. So as I feel for all children, keep them at home, because that's where you learn the emotional intelligence. You're going to create children who are much more successful by having secure attachments with you. So what do you think? Okay.